Hey Tony, it's Friday, and first off, to answer your question of the week, I've been doing a lot of hiking, been doing a lot of working out. I've actually I've been trying to go on a hike almost every day. I've been running, been doing a lot of sit ups and push ups and stuff. I'm trying to stay healthy because not only just staying at home will just drive me crazy as is, but it also this helps me stay healthier and stay active. So that's what I've been doing. It's worked so far. I haven't gone crazy just yet. Have gotten close, but I haven't gotten crazy just yet. Um, so now what I want to talk about this week, Tony, is I want to talk about President Trump and the media. Now, much can be said about how Donald Trump has really popularized the phrase fake news for any news that he disagrees with. But there's a lot more to it than just that, in which, as much as he says he hates the news, he actually thrives on it. And the reason why I'm saying that is because you can see during every single one of his press conferences, he always fields question from the news and he frequently acts out against the news. And then that's obviously reported for that news cycle until it all begins again the next day. Now, President Trump is certainly a media mastermind insofar as he understands how to get what he wants out and how to keep his name in the news. And it kind of turns into a vicious cycle because Donald Trump relies on the news as much as the news relies on Donald Trump. Now, I come from a journalistic background through undergrad. I wrote for the paper, and I've always been fond of journalism. But especially in the past 10 years, throughout the 2010s, one thing that kept becoming abundantly clear is the collapse of the news industry. What I mean by that is we still have a lot of news out there, but most of it is not through it's not through newspapers. It's mostly through online. It's mostly through uh, like TV news and things like that. And a part of that is because of the reality of news readership these days. Most people don't buy newspapers anymore. I myself, the only newspaper that I technically am subscribed to is the New York Times because that's what Dad subscribed to, and I still use that account. But even I myself do not subscribe to the news. Instead, I go to aggregate websites of all different sources, and it's how I read my news. And I tend to read the news at least once every day because I think it's important to stay knowledgeable in the world. But I am part of a bigger problem with that as well, in which no one's buying print news. No one's spending the money on these news sites because you can get it for free elsewhere online. And then that leads to the collapse of the news industry. Insofar as most newspapers and most aggregates end up getting a lot of their information, get a lot of their ad revenue through just that clicks on different stories. And so you've seen in the past 10 years how the journalistic integrity has collapsed in that regard, in which think about where people mostly get their news from. A lot of it comes from Facebook, a lot of it comes from Twitter, and a lot of it comes from other online sources. But those sources aren't necessarily concerned about reporting the news. They're more concerned about, okay, how many clicks can I get for this story so we can pay our bills, pay our writers, et cetera, et cetera. And that turns into a vicious cycle in which, okay, are people going to read this really expensive story that we put in on, say, corruption in this municipality? Or are they just going to see Trump says this and click on it because Donald Trump is always in the news? And President Trump understands this. And he understands how to get to his base. The biggest way he can do it to get his story out is through get his words out is through Twitter, of course, and by railing against, as he calls it, the fake news media. And fake news is anything that doesn't agree with what he doesn't agree with him. And that just his base and the people who actually really are focused on what he says just eat that stuff up because they look at it as they felt they've been forgotten for so long, and they're like, yeah, he's sticking to those liberal institutions that have left us behind, that only care about their coastal elites and don't care about us in small town America. Now, whether or not that's true or not is an entirely different story for an entirely different day, but it's something that we've seen throughout the past 5 years. because President Trump started his campaign in 2015, more or less, as did Ted Cruz. And we've seen this. We've seen this happen all the time, in which it's people believe this institution doesn't care about them, and so they love everything that attacks it. And so it turns into a strangely symbiotic cycle in which President Trump gets what he wants out, gets his information out, whether it be correct or not, and the news sites get clicks. And so it's kind of sad, in my opinion, because a lot of journalistic integrity has collapsed because of it. And there was a great John Oliver episode several years ago that was on journalists. And what it really focused on, and one of the people who was interviewed for it was the creator of the HBO series The Wire, who himself was a journalist in Baltimore, which is why The Wire is considered to be one of the most accurate representations of city life in TV history. And what he was saying is that we're about to enter into a golden age of political corruption, because the one thing that's always been there to try and stop corruption is the news. And if the news isn't there, like, think about how people get their news from BuzzFeed. BuzzFeed's not going to spend the money to end up trying to send somebody there to do any investigative reporting. And a lot of other organizations won't as well, because investigative reporting doesn't make money. It doesn't draw clicks, and it collapses that balance on the political system. And there's also kind of an interesting aspect in which the First Amendment, one of the premier parts of the First Amendment, is freedom of the press. And we're entering into an age where the press is free, but being the news is not free, in which you have to pay the money, you have to pay your workers, you have to pay your journalists, you have to pay a lot of money to write these stories. And if you're not making any money off of it, then you're just gonna have to look at the straight bottom line and go, well, I can pay all this money to do this vast investigative report, but how much is it going to make? And it leads us into this era of political corruption, because the reason why Watergate became as big of a deal as it was because the New York Times did a sharp investigative report on the DNC, on the Democratic National headquarters break-in, which led down this entire water hole of Watergate. And we just don't have that today anymore, because it doesn't make the money, and people, for lack of a better term, don't care. And I find it to be really sad, and it's going to be something that we're going to have to compete with for at least the near future. And by near future, I mean at least for several years, unless people actually start to realize how important it is to have the press exist and smash down on corruption. So it's gonna be a dark time for political accountability, and a lot of that can rest insofar as President Trump's relationship with the media, in which it's a vicious but symbiotic circle, and there's not much we can do about it. So Tony, my question for you is, what's your favorite place to get the news? Tony, I'll see you on Wednesday. Later, bro.